Good afternoon, everyone. On behalf of the Red Brick Summit 2020, we welcome you all to the TRBS Speaker Series. This year, TRBS has gone virtual, and we are extremely honored to host Sir Martin Sorrell, founder and executive chairman of S4 Capital. He is an alumnus of Harvard Business School and Cambridge University. He is the founder and former CEO of WPP, the world's largest advertising and marketing services company. Upon his retirement in 2018, he became the world's longest-serving CEO of an FTSE 100 company. Sir Martin has also served as a group financial director of Saatchi and Saatchi PLC. A renowned philanthropist, Sir Martin supports several leading business schools and universities, including Harvard Business School and Cambridge University. He also supports many charities, including his family foundation. The session has been designed as an interview. Sir Martin will be interviewed by Professor Asha Kaul and Professor Akshaya Vijayalakshmi. Professor Asha Kaul is a professor at IIM Ahmedabad in the communications department, recipient of several awards. Her research interests lie in corporate reputation and corporate communication. Professor Akshaya Vijayalakshmi is an assistant professor at IIM Ahmedabad in the marketing department. Her research interests lie in the field of impact of advertising and understanding responses to advertisements. We welcome you all to TRBS 2020. For any questions pertaining to the session, you can click on the link given in the description. Over to you, ma'am.
Thank you, Abhi. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So, welcome to TRBS, and we are very honored to host you, Sir Martin. I'll just get us started. Asha, is that okay with you?
Absolutely, Akshaya. Please proceed. So it's an honor. Let me also echo what Akshaya was talking about. I'd like to welcome Sir Martin. It's an honor for us to have you here. Akshaya, please begin.
Yeah, so we'll start with a very easy question for you. What is the most provocative thing that you have done in the media world which has changed the landscape of media as such? You've been in it for decades now. So what's something that you've done?
Firstly, let me say I'm delighted you've ruined my Sunday morning here in London by dragging me through all this. No, I'm delighted to be with you. I love India dearly. I'm obviously sad to see the impact of COVID-19 on the country and the people and the economy as we're seeing around the world. But I hope all my good friends and their families in India are as safe and well as they can be. And I hope we get out of this as soon as possible. I predict by maybe Q2 or Q3 of next year, but I think the winter here in the Northern Hemisphere is going to be pretty difficult. So with that as a forerunner, it's difficult for me to pontificate or say, what impact I had. I've had 3 lives, Akshaya and Asha, 3 lives. One was at Saatchi's, one was at WPP, and now my 3rd life in the advertising and marketing services industry at S4, which is a company we started, 2 years ago, and is already a dollar unicorn and a sterling unicorn with 2 billion pounds, 2.75 billion dollars of market cap, and we're focused in the digital area. If I look back, and it's not one thing in a way, but it's understanding, I think one thing that we've done, and I say we, not I, is identify 2 buckets of change. The one is the geographical bucket, and that started, I'm talking to business school academics or professors, and it started probably with Ted Levitt's article in the Harvard Business Review of October 1983, if I remember it rightly, where he wrote about consumers would become the same everywhere in every part of the world with goods and services. Now, he over-egged it to make a point. Interestingly, we did a reprise of his article at Harvard Business School in 2003. It was the 20th anniversary, and it was before he sadly died. I think it was of cancer. And he did say he over-egged the point to make the pudding. But that idea of globalization, which essentially was that people becoming more and more acquainted with goods and services on a uniform basis and tastes and preferences becoming more global did resonate. And that was the first bucket. So Saatchi's and WPP were built around the concept of building market share in a global industry, because that was the way that consumers' preferences were developing. Towards probably from about 1997 onwards at WPP, so for 23 years, we started to build a digital operation. And when I left in 18, it was about 40% of the operation. And I think it still is 40% of the operation. They haven't made much progress according to their own statistics on that. But the second area, the second bucket, was the technological bucket. So you have the geographical bucket and the technology bucket. And it was understanding the changes that were taking place in technology and their impact on consumer behavior, on consumer purchasing habits and preferences, and on all the other things that digital transformation had. And S4, our new operation, is totally different. S4 is totally focused on technology and totally focused on the change that's taken place in the markets, really, in the stock market, from what I would call a more balanced value approach between top line growth and margin. And what really sort of preoccupies people in terms of markets and total shareholder return, and that is top line growth. So I think it's really, coming back to the question, it's really understanding, or trying to understand the shifts that have taken place geographically. BRICS are next 11, which, after all, go back 200 years. The BRICS and next 11 were 40% of worldwide GDP. It's just that China, for example, has been on the wrong side of history for the last 200 years. And in my view, and in others' view, will be on the right side of history for the next 200 years. So it's about geographical change, and it's about this massive, whether you call it fourth industrial revolution, however you term it, this massive technological change and its impact. And within that, it's understanding that media had become more important, which we did in the 90s, understanding that technology had become more important, and building a different business. The S4 model is very different to the classic, the WPP, Saatchi and Saatchi model. That they were models that I liken to Unilever or Procter and Gamble in the detergent business, right? You launch another brand of detergent, it's going to cannibalize the market share that you have in other brands of detergent, your own brands, but you go ahead doing it because you build market share. That model is a busted flush, in my mind, in the advertising and marketing services industry. And what you have to do now in this new technologically driven world, in this top line driven world, is focus on growth and create a unified firm that attempts to address the needs of consumers and clients in a fully integrated way. So, the company, the ideas, I mean, the question you said, it was an easy question. It's actually quite a difficult question, because things are changing at a very rapid rate. As McKinsey says, the average company lasts in the FTSE 100 or the S&P 500 for 17 years. That would mean that WPP, which is now 35 years old, has gone through two life cycles. S4 is only 2 years old. I'm 75. I doubt whether I will be around for 17 years, but we'll see. My mother died when she was 90, so it means I've got another, maybe I'll just get to the 17th year. Whether I'll be compos mentis enough is another question. But no, I just think that those are the fundamental changes. And it, as I say, you said it was an easy question, but I think it's actually quite a it's a really important question, trying to understand what's going on. The geographical stuff is very easy to understand. I think you can see it from the data very easily. The technological stuff, if you're not an engineer like me, or if you don't speak code, is more difficult.
Right.
So I think those are the things I think I would focus on.
Yeah.
Okay, I would like to, Sir Martin, ask you if you've taken the look at the recent controversial Tanishq ad.
Yes, I have. I was
wonderful,
asked,
wonderful.
I was on CNBC TV 18, and they asked me exactly the same question. Yeah.
Yeah, we all are talking about it.
Well, there seems to be a lot of talk going on about it. So, there was a lot of trolling that happened, and it led to a lot of brand activism. So the company was forced to pull back the ad. So, so do you think it did the right thing? Because there's a lot of debate that's going on. Should they not have done that? When you start talking about brand activism, so there are a whole pile of things. This is just the right time for them to take on the position of being activists. But at that particular moment, they just decided to withdraw the ad.
And this ties closely with technology and content online, because most of the brand activism also seems to be driven online rather than offline. And
it also dovetails into the culture of the country. It also dovetails into timeliness. So, there's so many things that it dovetails into. So we definitely love to hear your views on that.
Well, look, you're not going to like what I say about. Firstly, let's deal with this whole area of purpose, right? And you're probably not going to like what I'm going to say. I think the business schools have got a lot to answer for, right? They over-intellectualize this stuff, okay? And I was always struck by a speech that John Brown, and this is ironic given what happened to BP in the Gulf of Mexico, but what he said in 1997 at Stanford Business School, he was a graduate of Stanford, and I think it was commencement, and he talked about, so this is 1997, you remember that BP had adopted the Helios and the green the green approach much earlier, renewables much earlier than the traditional petroleum companies like Exxon, etc. And John was chastised for taking a more, let's say, purpose-driven approach very early on. And we did a lot of the work at WPP around the BP brand and its repositioning. And in that speech, he said, if you're in business for the long term, you will embrace all the stakeholders. This is before Klaus Schwab was banging on about stakeholder theory and, talking about evolution of capitalism and the capitalist system and trying to make it more inclusive. And I think the reason why I say business schools are probably they make it too complicated is I think it's very simple. If you're in business for the long term, you are going to do everything you possibly can do in the interests of all stakeholders, not just your Friedmanite short-term shareholders. It's not the role of the company is to maximize profits, not in the short term, but in the long term. If you take that as the fundamental tenet, which I do, and actually put another thing together, which is fundamentally important, and that is ensuring that there is no separation of management and control, that the governance system ensures that the people who run the company have a significant economic interest in that long-term goal, then I think you've solved the problem. Now, that's the background to answering your question. And the answer to your question is, I think companies and brands and products and services have to take positions that consumers today and in the long term will expect the brands to reflect their values or to stand for their values and their ideas. So I don't think, to answer your question directly, I think brands have to do that. If you look at Unilever, for example, which obviously in an Indian context is enormously important, the last two CEOs, well, the previous CEOs took positions as well, but I would say the last two CEOs have taken violent positions on the power and importance of purpose. Paul Polman and now Alan Jope. In fact, when Alan Jope became CEO, he said, if any of my brands don't stand for something, if they don't reflect purpose or a purpose or whatever, I will get rid of them. Now, because that's a dangerous thing to do, coming back to your question, because in the case of the ad that was withdrawn, they took a position which probably, and I don't know the details, was probably in advance of what, if there is a general view, the general view was. So when you take a position, you have to be extremely careful that you're not going too far too fast. The reason it's important is consumers expect it, whether they're older, middle-aged, or younger. Maybe with the younger age groups, it's more important. We can debate that. I don't buy that. When I was at business school or at university, we took strong positions on various issues, and the things that we bought, or the things that we liked, or the things that we loved, were things that took those positions, that said that's the same things about themselves as we were trying to say. But maybe today it's much more sophisticated because of technology and because of social media and everything else. So I think you have to do it. But the problem is gauging the changing mores, habits, feelings, and you can get ahead of yourself. And by the way, it can become very painful. I don't want to go into the detail, but you know what I'm talking about. When you take a position, such as the Unilever position, and you say, everything I have should reflect certain values or a certain purpose, and if they don't, I'll get rid of them. Well, it can bite you. And, again, without going into you know exactly what I'm talking about. So you have to it can become very painful. So before you come out, before you do it, you have to think very hard about it, and you have to be prepared to take some pain, again, in the short term. Right. If you establish a principle and you breach that principle, it's going to be painful. But coming back to the question is, I don't think you have the option of sitting there and saying, for example, in our business, our people determine who we work for. If our people don't want to work on a certain client, they will tell us and they will down tools. So life has changed, okay? And a lot of our thinking is determined by what our people want to do. And if our people don't want to do something, we won't do it. So it's not just the consumer you have to think about, it's all the stakeholders. It's the pressure groups, as you saw in the example that you're talking about. It's government, it's your suppliers, it's your employees, it's your potential employees. It's such a thing. So I come back to the fundamental point. If you're in business for the long term, all of this stuff fits neatly into place. And going back to John Brown, he said, the example he used, he said, if you're in the oil business and you want to rip out the oil from the earth in the shortest possible time at the least cost, you'll destroy the environment. If you're there for the long term, you're not going to do it. So I think that's the critical issue.
So in continuation of the question, just one last question. When you talk about all the stakeholders being there, all stakeholders would have diverse interests. For instance, these pressure groups, they do not want anything that would kind of be advocated when it comes to secular India. But then the company has to take a stand, as you rightly said. Then only would they be recognized for the value that they get to the table. The employees want to be with them. The rest of India wants them to take a stand. So how do you bring about a compromise between all the stakeholders with their divergent views?
Or should there be a compromise at all? Like Ben & Jerry says, they have few loyal consumers and they're happy with that. Patagonia also has taken a stance, and like you said, long-term stance. So should we,
well, that's what management gets paid for. I mean, it's a thing called judgment, right? So somebody sent me, there's an Israeli professor who distinguished between intelligence and wisdom. It's a little bit of a tangential point, but there's a debate going on in our industry about the firing of old people. My old company, WPP, there's been an exodus of older people, and there is a feeling that the senior management at WPP now are too focused on youth and intelligence and not age and wisdom. And there's been an exodus of old people. And I just sent the tape to the senior person at WPP saying, I think you should take a few minutes of your valuable time looking at this. And the point of the story is coming back to, it's about wisdom and experience. And the point of that tape is, intelligence. Young people are intelligent. They don't have wisdom. And so you have to balance the two. So the answer to your question, it's about wisdom. Now, you can be wrong and you can make mistakes, but it's about balancing it. And I really think this is important. So in that, and there've been many examples of Nike took a view on bending the knee. A lot of people said they were wrong to do it, that it might offend some of their core constituency. A lot of other people said, no, it won't. It will just reinforce and develop their primary constituencies. So Asher, I think it's about judgment and wisdom and not intelligence and data. It's like taking the data and making a wise decision about the timing of the positioning. It may be that in India in 2020, that ad was wrong. It may be that in India in 2022 or 25, it might be right. So I think, and it may be that, if you took that decision in 21 as the wave started to move in the direction that you wanted to go, that if you'd run that ad in 21, you might have got a different response because things were changing. So it's about wisdom and judgment. And I'm not saying that I have it, because we all make mistakes. The trick is to make more good decisions in a day than bad decisions. But I think it's about judgment. I think the whole, look, I think it's a really important, I mean, the further I get involved, the more I'm convinced that long-term focus is critical, that making sure there is no separation between management and control is critical. Particularly in a technological age. The people who are entrepreneurial and people who are managers are two different breeds. And people who start stuff are usually not usually, most times not good at running stuff, and people who run stuff are not good at starting stuff. Different qualities. Combining the two is really, really difficult, but that's what I think you have to do. Because I don't believe, and it may not sound it, but it's fundamental to what you're talking about. I don't believe in short-term stuff. I don't believe in building something up, flogging it, and then starting again. I like building long-term. That's what our business is about, building long-term franchises. And so focus on the long term, uniting the two, ownership and control. I don't believe in bureaucracy and bureaucrats.
So, yeah. Since you're talking about long term and technology is, the way we look at it, it's very short term. We are responding, let's say the trolls, that was a short term response. So how do you look at data from we have different data points coming towards us. As an advertiser, how would you choose data which will help you in the long term, make long term judgments?
Well, this whole area, everybody says data is the new oil, right, which is not a good analogy. In fact, I was writing
oil is not the flavor of the season.
No, exactly right.
Neither are intellectuals.
So I modified it to data is the most valuable resource, because oil is no longer the most valuable resource because of pollution and climate change and everything. So data is not the new oil, it's the most valuable resource. And of course, the decisions, and we'll get into this, the decisions made by the platforms, one platform in particular, Google, and another hardware company, Apple, both of whom we have significant relationships with at S4. The decision made by them has made this issue around data even more critical, because what Google has said is we're going to nix third-party cookies in a year or so. They said this about a year ago, and they said it was going to be within 2 years, and so we're getting there. And Apple have changed their hardware such that third-party cookies are not effective anymore. So the most valuable data that you have, if you're a client of ours, is what is called first-party data, which is your consumer data. And you have it. Now, you have a response, coming back to our first set of questions. You want to build a business for the long term. I think you have to educate consumers about what they're letting themselves in for. When they sign up for a site, and I'm sure the two of you, just like me, have never said when you went onto a site, I don't accept. You certainly haven't read the legalese that they ask you to read. And you haven't sent it to your lawyer because that would take a month. So you just say accept, but you don't know what you're letting yourself in for. So we have to educate consumers, again, long-term thinking, make sure consumers know what they're letting themselves in for.
Just a clarification, by we you mean marketers, advertisers.
Yes, I mean, it's the data that I have, say I'm at Netflix, and the data I have about you and what you watch on Netflix or what you don't watch on Netflix. And I use that data together with the signals I get from Google or Amazon or Facebook or Geo with you. Now, that is going to become the most valuable of the valuable resource. We have to educate consumers that they know when they sign up what they're letting themselves in for. If the consumer wishes to sell his or her data, I believe they should be given that right, because it's their data, it's not mine. But they should go through a conscious process. And we should explain to them precisely what they're letting themselves in for. So they shouldn't find out, like, for example, I remember I was looking at a company in America about a year ago, a data company, and they were using American Express data. I'm an American Express card holder, and I was somewhat surprised, and I should have known about this, that they had my data and were using it. So I don't want to be in that position. I don't think the consumer should be in the position that he or she knows when they sign up what they're letting themselves in for. And if they want to sell their data, it's their data, they should be in that position. Having said that, the answer to your question is that first-party data is absolutely crucial in the future. And people in our industry who get sort of very intellectually upset, they say data destroys creativity, it hinders creativity. It's complete nonsense. It informs creativity. It makes creative decisions and ideas and thoughts more effective, not less effective. So I think the answer is that's the battleground. Mm-hmm. And by the way, it's the battleground amongst the clients, and it's the battleground between the clients and the platforms and the hardware companies, right, and the software company. That's the area where you're going to see the biggest fight over the coming years, because it's to control that data, and then of course government are going to be concerned about regulation, the issues I mentioned about consumers knowing what they're letting themselves in for, and misuse of that data. We've seen it already in elections. We're going into a US presidential election where there are already claims that there's interference, and I mean, it's very interesting. It hasn't seen much of the light of day yet, but I'm told that the Republicans, for example, are extremely sophisticated this time round in analyzing the 90 million people in America who don't vote. There's roughly 150 million people in America who do vote. I think it's it must be something like 240 million people who can vote. And there's 150 who do, and there's 90 who don't. The 90 tends to be poor white. And apparently, according to this reporter that I spoke to, the Republican Party data analysts we'll see what happens in the results of the election, are very focused on mining, if that's the right word, the vote, stimulating that group to vote. So data analytics, absolutely critical. And I use the electoral example because it is a lesson, I think, for our clients. The model that I think is the model is a data-driven model that curates or develops, from which you develop the content dynamically. It's not a TV ad that takes 3 months to produce. It's a piece of digital content which you test. You might test it programmatically and algorithmically. You get the result, you refine it. It's like a continuous loop. That's the model. And it works 24/7 in real time, because that's the way the world works now. That's the way consumers work. They don't work. It's not by appointment. They don't turn up at night like this morning. I don't turn up at 9 o'clock to watch a TV program. I can record it. I can watch it whenever I want. So it's not by appointment anymore. So it's always on 24/7, and that's a very different world.
So, Ashia, can I ask a follow-up question if you don't mind?
Please go ahead.
Yeah. So, what you said about first-party data makes me wonder if we are going to have a marketplace which is dominated by few players, but probably it's either going to be very diverse or it might be dominated by few players. And this question, we are having this discussion in the background of the antitrust case against Google. So, how do you expect how do you think things are going to change in the next few years because of this? Because governments are also very aware of how few companies seem to dominate the internet space. And yeah.
Well, I think it's inevitable, and we've seen this before in other industries. We were talking about the energy industry. We saw the dismemberment of Standard Oil, and we saw the dismemberment of AT&T and the Baby Bells. So we've seen it in energy, we've seen it in telecommunications. These companies have become very powerful, and then the regulatory. Once you hit, and this is unique this time because you have Apple and Amazon and Google all going over, and Microsoft all going over $1 trillion of market cap, and that has captured the imagination of reporters and editors, and has made people even more concerned about the scale of these companies. I don't look. At the end of the day, I think these companies, and I've always taken the position. When I was at WPP, I used to do a program at Cannes every year. And my first program, I think it was about 7 or 8 years ago, it was called the Cannes Debate on the Friday at midday. And the first, I had somebody from Google, somebody from Facebook, somebody from Yahoo. I think there was a fourth, I think from Microsoft. And the first question I ever asked 7 or 8 years ago was, are you a media company or a tech company? And they all said they were tech companies. And I said, no, you're a media company. And I think they should be held, and I've said this continuously, held responsible for their content. If fake news is out there on Facebook or Google or wherever it happens to be, they're responsible for it, and they can't duck it. They can't say they're digital engineers tightening the digital nuts on the digital pipes with their digital spanners. It doesn't wash. But they have changed. Having said that, they have changed. Facebook employed 35,000 people to look at editorial content. Google have stopped political advertising. Twitter has stopped. They're all making strenuous efforts. Why? Because they're worried about regulatory restraints if they don't. So, with power comes responsibility, and it goes with the territory. And I don't think, I don't think the regulators are going to do much good by breaking these companies up. If they do, from S4's point of view, it's not a bad thing, because instead of me giving you a list of 20 companies, which I can do, that we work with hardware, software, platforms, there'll be 30 companies. So it makes it more complicated. But I don't think it matters. It won't make any difference, I think, to Jeff Bezos or Mark Zuckerberg or Larry and Sergey at Google. They'll have 3 things to play with as opposed to one. So I think what has to happen is that they have to act responsibly, and they have to be pushed to do so. Do I think boycotts are the way to do it? No. I don't think the Facebook boycott achieved much. It might have drawn more attention to it. But the way to do that is for our clients and ourselves and the agencies to talk to Facebook directly. It's a bit like dealing with the Chinese. Humiliating them in public. They always say, loss of face. The Chinese dislike loss of face. I don't know whether that's true.
Yeah, we don't like.
whether that's true or not, probably is true, right? You know, drubbing Mark Zuckerberg in public, or Sheryl Sandberg or Carolyn Everson in public, I don't think is the best way to do it. The best thing is to get their attention, and tell them this is what you want to happen. And I'm sure you'll make progress. And the same thing applies to Google and to Sundar and everybody else. So I think it's happening. I think it's happening. And governments clearly have got a responsibility to make sure that there's not abuse of power. And these industries are becoming, I mean, I go to energy and telecommunications, those are utilities. This is a utility. So increasingly, there will be intervention and regulation. I don't happen to think that the DOJ Google suit, it looks to me like it's a rerun of Microsoft. It'll take a long time. My own view is it won't have much in the way of teeth, but you may have a new administration in 10 days or in a couple of months in America, which has a very different approach. We have to see. In Australia, the ACCC got very upset with Google, and they're putting in taxes, and there's the digital tax in Europe. Vestager has litigated against Google 3 times. I think 2 have been settled, and they've been fined, and 1 is still extant, I think.
Yeah, Amazon has pulled up over here via parliamentary committee.
Yeah,
go ahead. Sorry.
Sir Martin, would request you, I just read out a couple of questions that we have. You and I have a lot of questions, but I don't think I have time. I would need to go ahead with the questions that have been posted by some of the viewers. So the first goes this way. With the technology and digital space changing so rapidly across the world, what do you feel is the biggest challenge for media and advertisements, and how can one approach to tackle it if one wants to focus on the long-term developments and goal?
Well, it depends on who you are. If you're like S4, where we started with a clean sheet of paper two years ago, the challenges are very different than if you're, let's say, my previous existence, WPP, which started 35 years ago and has an analog presence. So I think, if you said to me, what's the biggest challenge for an analog company? It is that the digital transformation, and the biggest quality that is needed is agility. Having a clear purpose, having a clear structure, a less bureaucratic, very responsive, rapid decision structure, networked teams. So having a strategy and a structure, if you're an analog company, that enables you to transform digitally, that's the biggest issue. That's the biggest issue. For the new company, for S4, where we're focused on growth, and I do think focusing on growth top line, not to the exclusion of margin, but focusing on what the retailers call like-for-like store growth is the critical thing. For the new company, in, let's say, 3 years' time for us, when digital, instead of being 50% of the media market, is 2/3, 70%, we will be looking for the next new thing. We're already heavily involved in AR and VR and voice, but obviously the areas around AI become critically important. So I think the answer to the question is, depends on who you are. If you're analog, if there is any good to come out of COVID-19, it is that it has forced companies to abandon the resistance change agents we're seeing inside companies, big companies, medium-sized, small companies, change agents are really being given oxygen. So the biggest thing we hear is our 2024 plan we're going to implement in 2021. So people want to get on with it, and they're willing to take the change because COVID has blown a hole in most people's budgets, performance, Q2, Q3. Look at the ad holding companies. They're getting rid of 50,000 people around the world. That's a really sad phenomenon, but that's what they're doing. Why are they doing that? Because all their plans, they were just stumbling along. They've had to make more radical shifts and changes. So I think if there is anything good to come out of COVID, and it's been terrible, disastrous, but if there is any good, it is that it'll increase the pace of change and remove the barriers to change. So
Akshay, would you like to go ahead with the second?
Yeah, there's one question which really caught my attention, which is what has been the most significant undesirable change in consumer behavior and marketing communications in the last few years?
Whoa.
Yeah.
Well, I don't.
I'm thinking fake news and our beliefs in fake news, misinformation. I don't.
Look. I don't buy that. Look,
Okay.
If you go back in history, it's just the nature of it is different. I mean, if you talk about the rise of extremism in, let's say, in Europe, in Germany, if you examine what happened in Germany in the 30s and the rise of Hitler, etc., there are phenomena that are very similar. They're very different in terms of the way they were implemented, let me put it like that. I was going to use the word executed, which probably may have been the more appropriate word. But, there are similarities.
But the pace and scope is so different right now.
Yeah, well, that's the all-pervading power is very different. But fake news. There was fake news in Germany in the 1930s.
Sure.
There are many other examples of the same sort of thing. So it's not that it's different. It's that the power and scope is the thing. Now, regrettable, and what I don't know whether it's regrettable or not, but there is this feeling that the consumer has become more short-term. It comes back to our original question, and that the activation is more important than sort of strategy and long-term brand building. I don't believe that. I think that you can use technology and the modern ways of marketing to build consumer preference and consumer connection and love in very different ways. But if you were saying to me, I don't know whether I would classify it as being bad or not, because that makes me too judgmental in my mind. But the biggest shift has been, I think, in attention spans. That's the biggest shift, and it's coming to turn. I don't know whether that's a bad thing or a good thing. Just come back to your thing. You won't remember this because you weren't born then. But when you used to go into cinemas, they could flash a word. Well, they could do it on TV too. Marshall McLuhan. They could flash a word across. Drink Coca-Cola.
1960s, yeah.
Nanosecond that you didn't. It registered in your brain, and everybody was terrified that we would use subliminal advertising to influence people.
Yeah,
we've been here before. So no, I think the short term shift, I think, is the biggest. The attention span engaging people's attention, getting their attention is much, much more difficult now. And so creativity becomes even more important, but creativity in all the senses.
Asha.
So there's this interesting question which has come our way, which talks about cultural diversity and differences. What is the role of cultural diversity and differences in the field of media and advertisement? And what could be some good practices that global brands can do to ensure that their activities of building an international brand perception is in alignment with different cultures while maintaining a distinct position and perception? So it's a long question, but there's a lot of
no, there's a lot of meat there, and it's an interesting question, particularly when we've seen the fragmentation, the rise of populism, the rise, let's say, of nationalism, and fragmentation, and going back to Ted Levitt in 1983, a reversal or a potential reversal, basically because we didn't explain the benefits of globalization as well as we should have done. But let's assume for a minute it's going back. But the interesting thing about technology, and we're seeing that, for example, we've won some business recently where we're getting very significant conversion at scale with clients, because the technology has enabled you to build so many different approaches. So if I take Netflix, for example, for one of their series, we were able to produce 1.6 million, theoretically, 1.6 million alternative creative executions. And depending on what you as a consumer or anybody out there who's listening or watching this, depending on what you did or didn't do, we could alter the creative execution to reflect what your preferences were, or what we thought your preferences were. The interesting thing about technology, and this is the difference to 1983 and Ted Levitt, is that technology enables you to vary the execution much more effectively today than you were ever able to do it. So in the old days, you had a television commercial, you had to go out into the desert and shoot another one in a different language or whatever it happened to be, with a different approach, because people would argue, well, consumers, in the car business, people in Europe would say the French consumer looks for different things in a car that might be more about design. In Germany, it's more about engineering, whatever. Today, you can centrally produce stuff and disseminate it in a much more fragmented, targeted way. So I think the interesting thing about the question, that if the world is going to a more local, more fragmented, more national or more regional way, if power inside corporations is becoming more sort of decentralized, if, I'm not sure it is, but if the technology and what we can do now enables you to do that in a much more effective way today than it did when I started in the business, when I was at Saatchi's, and it was Manhattan landing with British Airways, and, it was one very expensive but very, very powerful TV ad or set of ads. So I think that is what's interesting about the question is, if the world is moving to a more local basis and more local execution, then the technology enables you to execute much more effectively.
Does that mean the death of the media planners?
It's not the death of the media planners. I think probably it's the rebirth. The media industry has become a commodity, the traditional media industry, not the digital. In digital, it's about brain, not brawn. In the traditional, it's about brawn. We know in India, WPP, I think, still has a 50% market share. It's not a transparent market. It has to be transparent, just like Japan has to be transparent, or China has to be transparent. Those days are going to go. You know, whether it's blockchain that achieves it, blockchain technology that achieves it or not, the market is going to have to become transparent. You know, the agencies can't exist or remain dependent on inefficiencies, or let me put it politely, friction in the system. It can't happen. You know, that has to go. And interestingly, I mean, the online ecosystem in many countries is pretty murky. It's becoming more transparent, it's becoming transparent, but it's still murky. That has to go too. So, you know, our model S4 is a totally transparent one. And we don't buy media as principal and arbitrage differences in value. So I think that, you know, I think that's the way. So media planning actually, I think, becomes more important. You know, if, for example, going back to a previous thing we touched on, if there's more regulation, if there's more fragmentation on the platform side, and you know, Amazon split into whatever, or as a result, if there's more fragmentation, media planning becomes more important. I mean, India is a really interesting example of what's happening digitally. I mean, Mukesh Ambani has done an incredible job. And I think the really interesting thing about India is that here is an Indian entrepreneur, immensely successful, not just in an Indian context, but in a global context, who's built an alternative. I mean, it's quite amazing what he has done.
So, sir, it's already just 2 minutes left. The last question, can I just field it quickly? What do you think is going to be the new normal in the next decade?
Well, you know, it depends on what we're talking about, Isha. I mean, look, I think what we've already seen, you know, we're a digital company. We have 3,000 people who are digital through and through. You know, if you cut them, they bleed digital, and they're digital only. It's not first or second nature, it's only. So adapting to working from home, adapting to dispersed living and dispersed working was first nature. I think that's going to be more, I call it the next normal, because I don't think there will be a new normal. It's going to be the next normal. So I think, look, you're going to have the concept of the corporation. I was very struck with a presentation. There's a Harvard Business School professor who specializes on working from home. And the last slide of his presentation was a picture of multiple people inside a company, pictures of each individual. And he said, you're going to have to think about the firm as being a collection of individuals, not as one organization. And you're going to have to refine what you do with individuals, just like we try and communicate with consumers one-on-one. You're going to have to communicate with people inside companies one-on-one. So if you look at what the impact of COVID, and I don't think, you know, I don't think we will go back to the normal. I think cities will change. The relative importance of cities would change. Dispersed living. So if I look at our people, they say we don't want to come into the office 5 days a week. We want to be there 2 or 3 or 4 days a week. We want varied commuting times. We don't want to be, you know, have to get on public transport, you know, irrespective of whether there's a vaccine and whatever. We want to have more flexibility. It's a better work-life balance for us. I mean, obviously, if you don't have the resources, COVID-19 has been a terrible thing, you know, living with your parents and you have young children or whatever it happens to be. So we all know the challenges. But the results of all this is going to be much more flexibility in working habits, how you manage. You know, I'm 75 years old, and I've always believed that the only way that you could control a company is everybody came into the office. It's not true. You're just going to have to do it in very different ways. And, whilst it's true, if you're recruiting, like we've been recruiting people, we've added, I think for the first half of this year, we were 22% up in headcount. By the end of this year, we'll be up about 35, 40% in terms of number of people, like for like, not with deals. We've added all these people. How do we get them to understand what S4 and its constituent content part is and its data analytics and media part? How do we get people to understand? Well, it's very difficult. And you're having to use technology to build relationships with people. That's very, we've hired people on Zoom. We bought companies on Zoom. Not that we knew nothing about, but so we're adapting our habits. So then the next normal, I think, is going to be very different. I do not think that we're going to go. I mean, I'm at the end of my career, and I certainly will not do in the future, from a travel point of view, from a working habit point of view, I won't do the same as I did before. I will travel. If I'm going to go to India, I'm not going to go to India alone. I'm going to go to Asia. I'm going to go there for about 2, 3, or 4 weeks. I'm not going to do a flight to Delhi or Mumbai or Bangalore or wherever and come back. I'm going to do a much longer, it'll be more intense and longer. And then, so it'll be a different pattern. And I'm going to use this tech. By the way, the other thing is this technology is not static. So in a year's time, we'll be able to communicate much more effectively using these devices. And the phrase I always use is "beam me down, Scotty." There will be some hologram or some piece of technology which will, we'll all be sitting in each other's living rooms. So it's going to change. It's going to change.
Thank you so much. It was a pleasure speaking with you. And let me do it the typical Indian way. And we look forward to your coming to India. We do look forward to your coming to India. Thank you so much.
Yeah, I hope so too. It's proving difficult to try. I think I'm going off to America shortly. So that'll be my first trip for 6 months. So I look forward to being with you in India. Our business there is growing very, very quickly. But we want to do equally big things to what we did at WPP in India in the future.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. And anything I can do to help you. And anybody wants to talk to me after this, Martin at s4capital.com.
Thank you. Thank you. It was a pleasure chatting with you.
Thank you, Akshay. If we can help you in any way with your academic pursuits on influencers and everything else, please let me know.
I will definitely reach out to you. Thank you very much. I appreciate it. I was going to ask you, are you following IPL? I know you like cricket.
I watched the game last night. It was a great game, actually.
Okay.
It was down to the last wicket last night. All I would say is Chris Gale is enormous.
Yes. Yeah.
And I loved Kohli's when he came into the dressing room after AB de Villiers had hit, Christ, goodness knows how many sixes, and he shouted out, "I love AB de Villiers." I thought that was a great moment in the changing. The IPL, I'm not so sure about the wickets, but the IPL is great, really great, really great. And stand by for those networks, those social networks, those technology companies to grasp the IPL. My bet, Facebook will come back and it'll be the sponsor.
We'll see that. Okay.
Thank you.
Sir, on that
Good to see you.
note, on behalf of the entire TRBS team, I would like to thank you for taking time out for us, especially on a Sunday morning. And for such an insightful session, it was indeed an honor for us to host you. It is
Thank you very much.
It was an absolute pleasure listening to you, and I'm sure the audience found it equally enriching. We would also like to thank Professor Asha Kaul and Professor Akshaya Vijayalakshmi for moderating the session. We are also thankful to the audience for being patient throughout the session and for asking such insightful questions.
Lastly, we would like to thank Business Standard, our financial print media partner, for their support. Next up, we present to you the founders of FinShots, who will be speaking on the topic Journey of FinShots and the reasons why we love finance. The details for the session can be found in the description box below. Thank you so much all.
Thank you so much.
Good luck.
Thank you.
Great fun.